Yeah, welcome you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ once again. And we've gathered here today to look at the life of Bonhoeffer. Yeah, very good evening. Yeah, uh, we've gathered here today to look at the life of Bonhoeffer and to understand his teaching and his contribution uh, to our community, the Christian community, and uh, and to introduce Bonhoeffer to us and to share his teaching to us. We have with us Brother Vijay Jacob. I'd like to say a few words about him. Vijay Jacob is Vijay Jacob is based in UK, and uh, he has done his dissertation on Bonhoeffer's understanding of pacifism and resistance. And I'd like to read a few words about him. Vijay was born and brought up in a Christian home and spent most of his childhood years living in a biblical seminary in Pune. Obvious to the security and protection that the seminary offered, Vijay grew up believing that his experience were the norm everywhere. It was only as he grew older that he realized campus life was a stark contrast to the real world outside. This newfound fascination for the outside world, coupled with the almost complete anonymity that it offered, was the start of a very slippery slide for him, drifting far and fast away from all he had been brought up with. He spent several years away from God and all that it meant. The nagging feeling like something was missing grew harder and harder to overlook. Pascal, in his book, Pensis, says, "What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in a man a true happiness of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself." It's reference from Blaise Pascal, Pensis 7-4 to 5. Thankfully, his parents' prayer and the patient hand of God remained faithful, much to Vijay's annoyance. After much wrestling and losing hope in all other avenues, he returned to seeking God. The prayers and guidance of many along the way have helped him overcome his fears, and he became a more committed and he began a more committed relationship. Yeah, and he began a more committed relationship with God. He then went on to do his graduation in theology in the UK, which was done purely with the intent of understanding the faith that he was following. Looking back, he considers those as the best years of his life. The decision to spend dedicated time studying and understanding the Word of God has strengthened his faith and resolved to share the joy he experiences. It was during this time at Bible College that he was able to read and study Bonhoeffer, who remains a role model for him. Since completing his course in 2017, he worked with Transworld Radio India, coordinating their youth initiatives. He currently resides in the UK with his wife, Roshni, and is expecting their first child in October. Amazing. So thank you, Brother Vijay. Thank you for your precious time and for being here today with us. So we want to commit the rest of the time to Brother Vijay to take it forward.
Thank you, Pastor Abhijit. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, firstly, for allowing me this chance to share something that I'm passionate about. I think everyone in some Christian meeting or church service has heard some quote of Bonhoeffer or the other. So I think everyone has heard of this name, Bonhoeffer. Just to give a little bit of insight, the word Bonhoeffer in Germany actually comes from, just like in Pune, we have Punawala and Bootwala, surnames like that. The name Bonhoeffer comes from bean farmer. So that's where the original title comes from, called, it's a German word which means Bonhoeffer. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen. I've got a few slides which I hope will just share, help shed some light on Bonhoeffer. Just bear with me a second. Okay, hopefully you all can see my screen now. Yeah, okay, great. So what I hope to do was initially just talk about what the fascination was with Bonhoeffer, why I chose Bonhoeffer, and what stood out for me. So Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor that was very active in his writing about church and his understanding of discipleship and community and all of that. But what really got my attention was the fact that he was assassinated for his involvement in an attempt to assassinate Hitler. So the first question that came to my mind was, how can a pastor be involved in a plan to murder someone? I think as a young teenager, I wrestled with a lot of questions, with Christianity and how it doesn't connect. So for me, Bonhoeffer was an excellent example of someone that actually wrestled with two very key issues. So that's what was my interest in Bonhoeffer, to find out, can there actually be an explanation for it in theology? So just to give you a brief idea of Bonhoeffer, we'll go right from the start. His father and mother was Karl and Paula Bonhoeffer. Karl was a very well-educated doctor and held the chair in psychiatry and neurology at the University of Berlin. He was also a director of the Hospital for Nervous Diseases. His mom, Paula, was a teacher, and they both come from a very long heritage of academics and doctors and teachers. So both of them were married in 1898, and there were 8 children. Bonhoeffer and his twin sister Sabine were the 6th and 7th children of Karl and Paula Bonhoeffer. And I've just put in a little bit of insight about the rest of the family, just so you can get an idea of the level of both academic and professional achievements in the family. So like the elder brother worked with Einstein. 2 of the brothers were in the army. One was a lawyer. So as you can see, all of them, they come from a family where, education and intellect was considered very high. So that all of this, I think, played a very crucial role into Bonhoeffer's, who he became. So that again is Bonhoeffer's twin sister, Sabine. So Dietrich, born on the 4th of February in 1906, was in Breslau, which was then part of Germany, but now is part of Poland. He had a typical childhood, growing up in a large family where they had a lot of pets. Some books record rabbits, guinea pigs, turtle doves, and all kinds of animals. They had a lot of attention from their parents. And the mother, being a teacher, firmly believed that the German education system was not suited for children. So she homeschooled all 8 of them until the age of 6 and 7, when they then joined public schools. So the family, Dietrich's questions with theology or with God, they say began at the age of 4, when he used to ask his mother, does God love the chimney sweep, or the person that cleans the chimney? And does God also sit down to have lunch? So his questions about God and all of this began at a very young age. The family always encouraged discussion. The mother was very firm in her belief in Christianity. They weren't really church-going Christians, as it were. They were more the homegrown variety. But everyday, daily life was filled with singing of hymns, reading of scripture, and it's noted that, you know, even his mother, when they were reading Bible stories, she would not read from retellings, but she would use the actual Bible itself, because that's how much she felt it is important that the children are exposed to it. So right from a young age, the children were always told, especially with the father and the mother around the table, that you do not speak unless you have something to say. So Bonhoeffer, right from a young age, was very articulate. He was always thinking, kind of formed good discussions. So at the age of 14, Bonhoeffer announced to his family that he wants to become a theologian. The family of academics and intellectuals seemed disappointed, because Bonhoeffer, they felt that it wasn't the best path for him. He was a very talented musician from a very young age, so they hoped he would pursue that as a career as opposed to theology. His elder brother, the lawyer, basically was in complete disagreement, and he said that the problem is the church itself. He said it is a poor, feeble, boring, and petty institution. And that is when Dietrich, young boy, aged 14, replied. He said, if that is true, then I must change it, or I must reform it. So, I mean, I think that was more in argument with his brother, trying to prove a point. But it is only as we go through the rest of his life that we realize how much he actually meant by that statement. So at a young age, when he, despite all of this, you know, all of his siblings kind of pushed against him and said, oh, why does God allow evil? And, you know, all kinds of questions that they would try and needle him with. But Bonhoeffer somehow was very reserved, very controlled in his responses. And then he said to another brother who was the scientist, he told Dietrich that you're basically turning your back on scientifically variable reality and escaping into the fog of metaphysics. So that's what the view of theology was. And, you know, it was just that it kind of is something that you speculate, like philosophy or something not substantial. So in response, Bonhoeffer is said to have said that even if your arguments, if you knock off my head, God will still continue to exist. So his conviction and, you know, his very firm belief in certain things was evident right from a young age. So to give you a background of his academic career, like I said, his homeschooling till the age of 7 or 8, and then he joined the traditional public schools of Germany, where as all of them did really well. He then went on to Tübingen, the university, where he did a German degree, which is called the Staatsexamen, which is essentially a master's and a bachelor's combined. So when he finished that, you essentially come out as a master student. So in his University of Berlin, he got the doctorate at the age of 21, which his thesis was titled Sanctorum Communio, which is basically a communion of saints. And the argument that Bonhoeffer presented in this dissertation was that there's a significantly different way that we need to look at the Christian church. That was his basis. And he said that the church is not a historical entity or an institution, but rather it is Christ existing as church community. So for him, Bonhoeffer was right from the start, was very bothered or very troubled or very concerned about the question of what is the church today. You know, a lot of his debate and his argument was stemmed from that question. And as we read through and go through the rest of his life, you'll see that comes up several times. So when he did his PhD, it's noted that there were 3 years, despite the staggering workload, he completed his dissertation in 18 months and had a full life beyond his academics. He was endlessly attending operas, concerts. He maintained huge amounts of correspondence with friends and family, and he was perpetually using every opportunity he had to travel. In some of his letters, he writes about his visits to Rome and his views of the paintings and things. So you could tell that Bonhoeffer was someone that drew deeply from all kinds of sources. It wasn't just church and Christian, but in fact, he went all over, and he all of this was what added to the full understanding and thought that he had. And then after he finished his PhD, he went to, he basically decided to do a habilitation, which is essentially another doctoral thesis, and it's defending it, and the successful completion of it then gives you a professorship in a university. So that was something Bonhoeffer wanted to do so that he could keep the academic path open as well. So in 1929, Bonhoeffer returned to the University of Berlin to write his postdoctoral thesis, which was called Act and Being. So in Act and Being, he traced the influence of philosophy on Protestant and Catholic theology. So, I mean, while that sounds really big, the simple basis of it, and I might be oversimplifying it, but basically he argues that theology is not another branch of philosophy, but something completely different, because back then the view was that philosophy, theology is a part of transcendental philosophy. So to kind of counter that argument, his thesis was that it's a completely different field of study. He argued that philosophy is man's search for truth apart from God, but theology begins and ends with faith in Christ, who reveals himself to man. And apart from this revelation, there can be no other truth. So his argument was that any philosopher or theologian who uses the philosophy argument is stuck in a loop that they cannot get out of. And he says it is only in that loop that Christ's revelation is breaking in. So it's not man breaking out, as it were, in philosophy and reasoning, but Christ coming in through the revelation. So, I mean, his work, not only in terms of theological aspect, but even from the language point of view, he was in German, all of his work is in German, and scholars have commented that even his use of the language, coining new words and terminologies, really kind of was way ahead of others in his time. He also studied in New York, where he did a postgraduate study, and that was a time that was very influential for his own growth and his own development in his thought. That's a picture of Bonhoeffer on his way to the US. Back then it was all ships. So the reason why he went for the postgraduate study was because after he completed his doctorate, he was still too young to be ordained as a minister. So to use that time, he went to New York. He didn't sign up for a particular program because they say he wanted to dip into different lectures. So he didn't want to sign up for one particular program. It's interesting that Bonhoeffer, so throughout his life, Bonhoeffer maintained constant communication with his parents. And that's something everyone has commented, that his relationship with his parents was very strong, and he would write to them, wait for their consent before he kind of made decisions or did things. So in one of the letters he wrote to his parents while he was in the US, he actually wrote that the American seminary is not up to his German standards. He said, and I quote, he said, "There is no theology here." This was interesting because even though he felt that the theology was lacking, and I think Germans were far ahead in the whole theological debate. So it's natural that coming to another context, he didn't see that. But he had a lot of life-changing experiences while he was at New York. He met Frank Fisher, who was an African black seminarian, who basically introduced him to the Baptist church in Harlem, which is the African kind of gospel church. Bonhoeffer went on to teach Sunday school in that church and formed a lifelong love for African American spirituals, a collection which he took back to Germany. Bonhoeffer's time with the black church, he said he felt he was able to view the church from the bottom. He said from those that were suffering, from those that were outcast, and those that were persecuted, he began to see things from below, from the perspective of those who suffer oppression. And it is here that he says, here one can truly speak and hear about sin and grace and the love of God. The black Christ is preached with rapturous passion and vision. And I think this is what he said was missing in the American churches. It was very not getting into real issues that people were facing. So while he was here, he continued visiting different places in America. He traveled by car throughout the United States to Mexico. He was invited to speak in several places. He also, and it was these visits where he visited all these different countries that opened Bonhoeffer to seeing the church as an entire global body. And so that was, again, a very key part of where of his theology being formed. So this is basically a quote. On one of his trips, they were driving down to Mexico, and they stayed in tents. So they were sitting around the tents having their dinner around a fire. And one of them, a Frenchman named Jean Lesser, when they were talking about it, said he wanted to become a saint. So at that point, Bonhoeffer wrote about that incident. And that's where he says, at that time, I was very impressed, but I disagreed with him and said, in effect, that I should like to learn to have faith, because he felt the faith that took his friend to want to become a saint, he felt that was lacking in him. But then he goes on to say that I discovered later, and I'm still discovering right up to this moment, that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. One must completely abandon any attempt to make something of oneself, whether that's a saint or a converted sinner or a churchman, the religious type as we call them. By this worldliness, what he means is living in the duties, the problems, the successes and failures of life. So it's not trying to disconnect yourself from it, but rather being in it. And he says it is when we throw ourselves completely into these challenges that we, leave ourselves to the arms of God, taking seriously then not our own sufferings, but those of the God-man in the world, watching with Christ in Gethsemane. So for him, the idea of the suffering Christ was very key to a lot of his, and so he goes on to say that, according to him, is the faith, and not just being able to fit into the religious groups. Post that, Bonhoeffer returned back to Germany in 1931, where he became a lecturer in systematic theology at the University of Berlin. He was appointed by the World Alliance for promoting international friendship through churches. This eventually is what now has become to the World Council of Churches. So initially back then, it was the World Alliance for promoting international friendship. At this time, so as part of his role in that council, He was one of the 3 European youth secretaries for that organization at that time. It was at this time that there seems to have been a change from being a theologian primarily connected to the intellectual or the academic side, that he moved to more practicing it, becoming a man dedicated in the actual outworking of that. So in 1931, at the age of 25, he was ordained at the St. Matthew Church in Berlin. He was ordained as a minister. And while he was teaching, before he got ordained, he noticed an appeal, and that is the picture here. There was an appeal for a teacher of a confirmation class at a Lutheran church in Berlin, on the other side of the tracks from where Bonhoeffer stood. This is interesting to note because Bonhoeffer comes from a very affluent family, as you can imagine, the son of a doctor and very well-respected doctor. So they grew up in a very protected, almost, the rich side of Germany. So the interesting thing that he's pointing out is that the ad came from a confirmation class on the other side of the tracks, which meant, from the lower strata of society. And so he goes on to say that these were rough kids who had already chewed and spat out a few prospective teachers. The pastor was hoping to get an idealistic seminary student who was still silly enough to accept the challenge, in his own words. But Bonhoeffer agreed, and they say that when the pastor took Bonhoeffer to the group of boys there to be introduced, they just started shouting Bon, 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 just to kind of basically prevent him from speaking. So Bonhoeffer very calmly stood there, leaning against the wall, and eventually said he was going to tell them about his time in the US. And he said, if you listen, I will say, if you don't, you leave. And they say that never did he have a problem with discipline in his class again. So Bonhoeffer clearly had a way with young people and a way with getting people interested. When the day for their confirmation finally came, a day that the pastor said will never happen, but actually Bonhoeffer took them through, and he took all of them to the tailor and got them all suits stitched. So people say that he was the kind of professor who would just as soon pull out a football and hit the football field as he would with his students in the lecture room. So he was truly getting involved in the lives of these people. So the students recall that after some of the soccer games, he would stop and play some of the records of Negro spiritualities that he picked up from Africa, from his time in America. So it's evident here that, for Bonhoeffer, education or teaching someone went hand in hand with discipleship. And that was, very clearly evident in his interactions with these young people. There were also, I was very fortunate to kind of, as part of my research, I was able to visit Berlin and visit some of these places that Bonhoeffer actually went. And so they were saying that Bonhoeffer used to go to a neighborhood bakery and collect all the stuff that's about to go waste. And then he would take that to his flat and then get all these young kids from the street to come up and say, come and have a meal. And then he would start talking about things like life and God and religion. So he was very involved in getting people interested in what he had to offer. This again is another quote by Bonhoeffer, and it's one that I think sets the stage for the next half, because he says we must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. And that is exactly what happened to Bonhoeffer. Because despite his academic brilliance and everyone wanting him to continue lecturership and all of that, his career took a dramatic change when the Nazis got into power in January 1933. Bonhoeffer was a determined opponent of the regime right from the first day. And in fact, 2 days after Hitler was installed as chancellor, Bonhoeffer delivered a radio address on the national radio, which he openly attacked Hitler. And he warned the German country, he said, against slipping into an idolatrous cult of the Führer, which was Hitler. And he said that the Führer could very well turn out to be a Wehrführer or a misleader. So he said the problem with putting our trust in a person is that the person can flip and it can be misleading. So while he was in the middle of this address, he was cut off by the secret police. They cut off the address. So right from day 3 of Hitler's thing, he was basically he went against Hitler's thing. So this is the group called the German Christians, or the Deutsche Christian, began to promote the Nazification of the German Protestant Church through the creation of a pro-Nazi, or the Reich Church, which is what you see here. And it's interesting, but the Reich Church essentially acknowledged Hitler as the head of the church. And Bonhoeffer was very vehemently against this. So if you can see in the second picture, it's actually the inside of a church where all religious objects were moved. So no crosses, none of that. And it was replaced with a copy of Mein Kampf, which is the autobiography of Hitler, and a sword, and the swastikas were all over. And many members wore Nazi-style uniforms. So this went on, and it kind of got worse. The German Christians wanted to push for the implementation of Aryan laws, which essentially meant that only Aryan, the thoroughbred Aryan race, could be part of the German church, which essentially then pushed away anyone else, like Jews or anyone like that. The German Christians claimed that Jews were a separate race and could not become members of an Aryan German church just through baptism. So this was a big issue. They instituted it in the churches all across, to which Bonhoeffer wrote a very strong rebuttal. And his article in his April 1933 essay was called "The Church and the Jewish Question," which basically spoke about the role of the church in society and the role of church and state, because that was issues that were very connected until then. So the church, addressing the challenges facing his church under Nazism, Bonhoeffer in this essay argued that National Socialism was an illegitimate form of government and hence had to be opposed on Christian grounds. He outlined 3 stages of this opposition, which he said Christians are called for. The first was that the church was called to question the state injustices. So, for example, actions being done, the church had to raise a voice against it, make the state aware of injustices. The second was that they help all the victims of state injustices, whether they were Christian or not. And finally, the church might be called to put a spoke in the wheel, which is essentially to bring the machinery of injustice to a halt. And this is clearly what he went on to, and this is what convicted him for his actions in the rest of his life as well. The essay that he wrote revealed the complexity of Bonhoeffer's thought and action. It was one of the clearest and earliest repudiations of National Socialism, revealing his early opposition to the regime. On the other hand, the theological section of the essay contains the traditional anti-Semitic teachings that for centuries had characterized the Christian understanding of Judaism. Bonhoeffer argued that the Jewish question would ultimately be resolved through the conversion of the Jews. He never abandoned that view. As a result, because of the opposition to this German church, in August 1933, Bonhoeffer and Hermann Sass were deputized by the opposition church leaders. So there was the German church, and then the leaders that didn't agree formed the opposition church. So the opposition church asked Bonhoeffer and Hermann to draft the Bethel Confession, which essentially becomes a new statement of faith in opposition to the German Christians. The Bethel, so Bonhoeffer and the other person did it, but however, when the final confession was drafted and all the edits were made, Bonhoeffer himself refused to sign it because he felt it was too watered down. So Bonhoeffer had these very high standards that he held himself to, and refused to kind of budge from there. In September of the same year, Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller, they started what would then later become the Confessing Church. And that later then Karl Barth and all of them would get involved as well. But that was basically the start of it. And although not large, this group here, the Confessing Church, did represent a major source of Christian opposition to Nazi government. The Barmen Declaration, drafted by Barth and adopted by the Confessing Church, insisted that Christ and not Hitler was the head of the church. However, a lot of the reorganized Protestant and newly established Nazi submissive churches began being influenced by Nazism and consented to the Nazification of their churches as well. In September 1933, the National Church Synod approved the Aryan paragraph that prohibited non-Aryans from taking any posts in parishes. When Bonhoeffer soon after was offered a post in Eastern Berlin, as a protest, he refused the post, saying, "I refuse to be a part of this." That's when Bonhoeffer accepted a 2-year appointment as a pastor of 2 German-speaking Protestant churches in London. The reason why I put this blue plaque is it's a very British thing. Whenever a famous person stays, they put this plaque outside the house. So even now, when you go around some of these places, you can still see these plaques. So you know, like Bonhoeffer lived, and so he was there from 33 to 35. So this is outside that site where he actually lived. So yeah, so this is where Bonhoeffer came to the UK, and a lot of people, he drew a lot of criticism for it because a lot of people felt he was running away from the problem. He was distancing himself from the German church. So Karl Barth accused Bonhoeffer of abandoning his post and wasting his splendid theological armory while the house of your church is on fire. So it was very, very strong, harsh words that people, said against him. But basically, Bonhoeffer did not go to England simply just to run away from the German problem. Essentially, he responded to Barth saying that, "I am disappointed with the lack of support from the church. And I feel this is my moment of wilderness," which again draws to the biblical, drawing away to kind of refill himself. So the other thing Bonhoeffer was very actively involved in while he was in the UK was he spoke about what's happening in Germany. He made people aware of the atrocities happening in the church. He spoke at a lot of international gatherings and rallied people in different parts of the world to oppose German Christian movement. When Bishop Theodor Heckel, the official in charge of the German church's foreign affairs, traveled to London and told Bonhoeffer to abstain from speaking in other churches, Bonhoeffer basically refused, straight point blank. So Bonhoeffer, in keeping to his principles, he didn't kind of let it go or slide in any way. In April 1935, Bonhoeffer, who you can see here is on the second from the left, Bonhoeffer returned to Germany The church was under increasing pressure from the secret service of the Nazi armies. Most church leaders refused to openly oppose it because they were worried about what, the repercussions of it. As a result, the radical confessing Christians were found that they were starting to get attacked from all sides because they were very openly against Hitler and all of that. So Bonhoeffer began training young trainee pastors for the confessing church. And that's when he started this seminary in Finkelwald. It was considered illegal because he was not allowed to teach or publish any articles in Germany because he was banned. So this was basically an underground seminary that they were running in the homes of patrons and places like that. So in August 1937, the Secret Service declared the education and examination of the confessing church ministry candidates illegal. In September 1937, they came and closed the seminary, and by November arrested 27 pastors and former students. It was around this time that Bonhoeffer published his best-known book, The Cost of Discipleship, which is basically a study on the Sermon of the Mount, in which he attacked cheap grace and costly grace. We'll look at some of these concepts further, but just to kind of give you a timeline, it was in this seminary experience that he wrote about community and discipleship. So it came, a lot of it, while it was cerebral, a lot of it came from his own actions and practicing and living on campus with these students. And now comes the most controversial part of Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was an agent of the German Secret Service. Now, that sounds very very misleading and can often say that, then how can we justify it? But it's important to understand that Bonhoeffer, the only reason why he joined the Secret Service was basically because of his brother-in-law, Hans von Donani. He was the one who initially introduced Bonhoeffer to what was called the Abwehr. It's the military secret service. And he said that there's a group within the German military intelligence that is looking to overthrow Hitler. So that's what kind of got Bonhoeffer in. And he also learned from Donani that the war was imminent, and he was troubled by the prospect of being conscripted in the army. So that was another fear that was, because the war was coming, you're going to be thing, that was also on Bonhoeffer's mind. And as a committed pacifist, opposed to the Nazi regime, he felt he could never swear an oath to Hitler and fight in his army. So this was again a very a stand he took. Sorry.
Can you explain the term pacifist?
Sure. So the idea of pacifism originally comes from the point that you cannot take another man's life or action in the form of, to kind of take stern action in the place, like, fight someone, to take a life, all of that. Is that something that is possible or not? So to kind of start with the beginning, like Bonhoeffer was always considered a pacifist because it clearly comes from his Christian views. What is created of God, and what God has is it's not something that we can alter. So I'll just read out a bit of it. A general definition of pacifism would be to share the conviction that employment of violent coercion is evil, that war is a form of violent coercion that is not allowed. So essentially it's against war and against evil or violence as a way. That's the view of pacifism. But for a lot of scholars have commented that with Bonhoeffer, his cannot be termed as just a pacifism in the standard sense, but rather it's a Christian peace ethic. So for Bonhoeffer, the point of his coming was from the Christian perspective. So in principle, anyone opposed to violence in any form, especially war, is a pacifist. But Bonhoeffer's ethic was not an ethic just of principles, and pacifism cannot be summarized by him as a principle of nonviolence. So he did certainly advocate nonviolence, and he supported the objection to military service, but he rarely described himself as a pacifist. You know, it's all titles that have now kind of been added on to him. So from that kind of perspective, to change to this, where you're actively resisting. So that's the kind of contradiction that I was looking at in my dissertation as well, from pacifism to resistance. What caused that change? And a lot of people argue that it was the situation in Germany, you know, the way circumstances changed. But essentially, when you look through Bonhoeffer's life, you find that throughout, it remained rooted in a very firm biblical Christian understanding. You know, so even though he was reacting to circumstances and situations around him, it was from a very biblical perspective. So the move, I hope that makes sense. Yeah. So the move to the Secret Service was essentially because his brother-in-law said, if you join the Secret Service as such, we can, using your contacts, you can basically, we will show you as part of the Nazi Secret Service, traveling for that. It gives him permission, it gives him freedom to travel and all of that. But essentially what he was doing was not related to the Nazi kind of thing in any way. It just allowed him freedom to travel because he was banned from traveling. He was banned from speaking, publishing, all kinds of things because of his writings. So this kind of gave him that freedom to be moved on. He was also worried about the consequences of refusing military service because a lot of the German Christians felt that that was a Christian calling, right? So he didn't want to upset them either. So he used his position in the Secret Service to travel freely around the country and as a way to keep up with his students from the Bible college that was, you know, discontinued earlier. Bonhoeffer, there's an interesting movie which I think is available on YouTube called An Agent of Grace. It's essentially, it talks about the story of Bonhoeffer. And in that there's a scene where Bonhoeffer walks into his room and the brother-in-law and this other guy, they're actually building a bomb. And Bonhoeffer, and this could be dramatized, I mean, because, you know, for the movie, but Bonhoeffer basically says, why are you showing me this? You know, what have I got to do with this? And then there's an awkward silence where they're kind of like, right, well, you know, and then the person who has the bomb basically says, Pastor Bonhoeffer, will you pray for me? So here's a man, you know, about to step out in an assassination attempt. He was hoping to assassinate Hitler with that bomb. And before he leaves, he's telling Pastor Bonhoeffer, can you please pray? So you can, you know, I think the movie captures it brilliantly, and I would encourage all of you to have a look through it if you have the chance on YouTube. But Bonhoeffer has this stunned silence, and then he responds in his calm, collected voice. He says, we can all take courage in the words of Christ, which says, no greater love has a man than to lay down his life for his friend. I mean, you know, for me, that was just like such a powerful, you know, how do you respond to things like that? But even there was a very firm Christian foundation to his responses. So, yeah, so coming back in his involvement, he basically continued traveling. He kept writing. He kept encouraging other churches in different parts of the world to kind of raised their voices against it as well. So he wrestled with all of what was going on, and I'm sure he would have heard at least secondhand information about the plans to assassinate Hitler and all of that. So that was clearly something he struggled with. But it's evident from all of the scholars that write about him. It's saying it was war, and these Germans were convinced that Hitler was an enemy to the German state and German people, as well as to the other nations, and that's why they went for it. So whatever Bonhoeffer's contribution was to this group, the one thing that is certain is that he definitely did not make it lightly. This was something he clearly thought through and, kind of was sure of what he was doing before he stepped into it. After the Gestapo, so basically there was an attempt to assassinate Hitler, which failed. And that's when the Secret Service kind of got a lot more information. They found out about the group and, they kind of investigated it. So after the Gestapo, the Secret Service uncovered that funds were sent, secretly and all of that. Bonhoeffer and his brother-in-law were arrested in 1943. Bonhoeffer was initially charged with conspiring to rescue Jews, using his foreign travels for non-intelligence matters, and misusing his intelligence position to help the confessing church pastors evade military service. So, as much as they say he was involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler, the charges that were against him were very clearly listed. For a year and a half, he was kept at the Tegel prison, awaiting a trial. It was only 4 months after he was actually arrested that they issued his charges, and his parents actually got to know of what charges were against him. For a year and a half, Bonhoeffer was in prison. He continued his work in religious outreach among fellow prisoners and guards. Sympathetic guards helped smuggle his letters out of prison, and these letters formed the foundation of his work, which is now, it has now been published and is available. Again, another book which I would recommend is Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison. This is a series of letters he's written from while he was in prison. And just reading through it, I mean, a lot of it is very, intellectual. Like, he's very deep in his thoughts, and simple things is explained very deeply. But some of his ideas that he expresses from within prison is just phenomenal. So he was eventually, he continued in prison until, and one prison named Corporal Knobloch even offered to help him escape the prison and said, "I will make you disappear with me, don't worry." But clearly that didn't happen, because he declined, saying that the Nazi retribution on the church and his family would be far greater if he did that. After the failed attempt on July 20th, his connections to the broader resistance were discovered, and he was moved to the Secret Service prison in Berlin. In February 1945, he was taken to Buchenwald, and in April moved to the Flossenburg concentration camp. It was there on 9th April that he was hanged with other conspirators. His brother Klaus Bonhoeffer was also executed for resistance activities, and his brother-in-laws Hans von Donani and Rudiger Schleider. So all 4 of them were assassinated by that. And this was someone, the camp doctor, that basically said this of Bonhoeffer. And this was literally just before he was hung. He says, "I saw Bonhoeffer kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and certain that God had heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer, and then he climbed the few steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued after a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man so entirely submissive to the will of God. And I think this is the testament. This is the Bonhoeffer story, isn't it? That it's not because of his successful plan. It's not because of any of that, but essentially that even his involvement in there was so firmly rooted. So I think the important thing then that we all have to ask of Bonhoeffer is, what is his theology? You know, what is this? And I think the two pillars that formed the basis of Bonhoeffer's theology was his Christology, or the question, who is Jesus Christ? And this is essentially something that you'll see throughout. And this might sound like a rather academic exercise, but this was something that really caught my attention. I'm quoting now from Bonhoeffer's university lectures in Berlin. And this was one of his most explicit or most well-renowned work that talks about Christology. So he says that the uniqueness of Christology as an academic enterprise is essentially that it has two questions. Sorry, I'm just gonna, I've got that. Yeah. So the uniqueness from other expertise is every study or every research kind of looks at two possible questions, and that is the how and the why, which you know, like in science or history or whatever, the two examples or the two questions that we ask is the how and the why questions. So he says all answers to these questions come down to a system of categorization based on the relationship of the object in question to ourselves. So like if we're asking of science, the question is us in relevance to the how and the why. But in the case of asking who is Jesus Christ, this classification does not exist, because the man's logic or reasoning is confronted with God, and it is beyond our classification, understanding, and reasoning. So this incomparable, incomprehensible other is what he calls it as. You know, the exercise of understanding Christ through the how and the why is not possible. So he says the only question we can ask is, who are you? We can't ask how or why because we can't understand. So we ask who. And he says Jesus Christ offers a response to this question. And it is in the church as the community of faith where this answer is pondered and reflected on. So he says that the Christology, recognizing the who are you question as the main question, rules out all the other questions. And I think that's why even Christ asks, who do you say I am? You know, and that's where Bonhoeffer says this idea of understanding Christ has to come from a place of belief. The fact that the revelation of God in Christ can neither be established or disputed scientifically is something that Bonhoeffer emphasizes. He says that the testimony of Jesus Christ is self-authenticating. So what does that mean? Is basically is saying that if we try to understand the how and the why, we're trying to go above God, which is against the whole idea of God. So instead, the question we ask is who. And it is to this answer that it is to this question that Christ himself appears in history, in flesh, and says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So for Bonhoeffer, the Christ becoming human is very important. And the question of how the truth of revelation can be conceived, or how this revelation is true, if we try to dig into that, it then says we're trying to strive again to get above the understanding of God. So for Bonhoeffer, it's important to begin with the person of Christ as present. It's a present reality, understood within space and time, not some abstract idea. And here and now is in and through the church. So it is only because he's present that we can question him. This presence in the church, where the understanding of the presence opens up the understanding of the person. So Bonhoeffer says that it's in the church context that we truly understand Christ. And he goes on to say that Jesus Christ is the present Christ only as the crucified and risen one, and that the Christ who is present is the historical Jesus of Nazareth. So the response, in what form is Christ present? Bonhoeffer says is threefold. First, Christ is present in the Word of the church, but also as the Word of the church. The second, he says, the Christ is preached as sacrament, which is the form in which the Word reaches man in his nature. And the third is he's present as church and in the church. So throughout his arguments, Bonhoeffer proves that the centrality of Christ is key. That he, the one who is present in word, sacrament, and church, is in the center of human existence, of history and nature. It belongs to the structure of this person to be in the center. I mean, please feel free to interrupt, but with Bonhoeffer, I think the thing is, a lot of it has to be read, reread, and looked at multiple sources. So yeah, I apologize if any of this is sounding too academic. But essentially, this idea of Christ in center is something that is foundational to Bonhoeffer. He follows it in everything that he refers to. And then the third aspect of God becoming human is, again, there are two key themes to his understanding of Christology. He says Christ as the one who became man, and Christ as the humiliated and exalted one. So the name Jesus Christ itself for Bonhoeffer was the idea of God's becoming human. And this is a term he keeps using with the German phrase Menschwerdung, or becoming human, which he says that one cannot claim to know the man unless he acknowledges Jesus Christ the God, and one cannot acknowledge Jesus Christ the God unless at the same time he acknowledges that Jesus Christ is man. The two factors cannot be isolated because they are not separable. He says, this one God-man is the starting point of theology, is the starting point of Christology. So in describing Christ as God, Bonhoeffer says that we should not refer to Christ as a representation of God or the idea of God. Rather, we must speak of his weakness, his manger, and his cross. This man is no abstract of God. So the humiliation on the cross and what Christ went through was basically necessitated by the world under the curse, into which God of his own free will enters, and to quote Bonhoeffer, as a beggar among beggars, an outcast among outcasts, and as dying among the dying. This humiliation is necessary because of faith in signs, miracles, or plainly manifest deity, or the unchanging God of philosophers is no faith at all, Bonhoeffer says. And that, again, is reiterated in Hebrews, where it says, the assurance of things hoped for. That's what faith is. So it's not just in what is clearly visible. So that was the first pillar. The second is ethics. And I notice my dad's on here, so I'm not going to say too much. But ethics is essentially the relation to how things relate to around us, right? So Bonhoeffer's understanding of ethics as well was again firmly planted on Christology. So in his view, the Christology required him to perceive fully and participate in a relevant, informed, and responsible way in the secular life of this day. So his understanding of Christology, according to him, required him. That understanding ensures that you cannot then avoid engaging with the world. And this, he says that it's one of his most extensive work, the ethics book, which he started while he was in prison, but it wasn't completed. So it was completed later, after he passed away, by his friends and other scholars. So according to Bonhoeffer, Christian ethics is not the reality of oneself or the reality of the world, nor is it the reality of standards or values. It is the reality of God as he reveals himself in Jesus Christ. So then he says the problem of ethics should not be how can I be good or how can I do good. But Bonhoeffer argues that the true question of ethics is what is the will of God? And that is the point that Christian ethics should start from. Because he says inquiries about our own being good or doing good is kind of assuming the self, the world, and all as the ultimate reality. But that's what Bonhoeffer says, that the ultimate is still to come, And so he says, reflection seeks to achieve the self becoming good and the world being made good through one's actions. That's what ethics traditionally stands. But with Bonhoeffer, he says the ultimate importance is no longer that the self or the world should be good, but that the reality of God should show itself everywhere to be the ultimate reality. So it's like a completely different perspective in the way he approached it. So faith in God as the ultimate reality allows all concerns with ethics to have as its starting point God, who shows himself to be good, even if the self and the world are bad. So again, this whole idea of God being the starting point in his response, and this is where Bonhoeffer kind of brings in another concept where he says the problem is the thinking in two spheres. He says the problem is one holy, supernatural, and Christian sphere, and one wholly worldly, profane, and natural or unchristian. But Bonhoeffer says that this cannot be the case. There can only be one reality, in which the reality of Christ in the whole of the world, that can only be the reality. So, yeah, and then he goes on, to talk about the behavior of humans, what we're called to do, and responsible action, which again is another very important concept, because this is what basically shows his clear rationale for why he was involved in these plans. So responsible action, Bonhoeffer starts off by clarifying that it's a very risky venture, because it makes no claims to objectivity or certainty. It is a free venture, and it cannot be justified in advance. So the idea being that we are so submitted to the will of God that our whole lives are a response to the question and call of God. So then there is no kind of certainty that this is the path I will follow. Like the academic that he was, suddenly with the church movement and all of that, suddenly saw him change away. So that's where what he means by saying there's no certainty. It's a completely free venture, and it cannot be justified because you don't know where the Lord is calling you. So you cannot justify your actions in prior. You know, the whole objective of a responsible man or responsible action is submission to the will of God. This demand for responsible action is a demand no Christian can ignore. The failure to act is simply to condone evil. And I think this is a quote that has been, put all over the places. And this is where he kind of develops that idea. He says the failure to act is to condone evil. But it is also clear that we have no justification for preferring one response to evil over another. So there's no right answer for evil, And he says, as he says, that there can be no justification in advance without criteria for good and evil, and that is not available to us. So the demand for action without any prior justification is a reality he says Christians have to face. And if you are not facing it, then we're ignoring that call. So it's a very, it goes into much detail, and it kind of takes quite a bit to explain some of these concepts. But I hope this conversation will just kind of get you interested to explore this, because some of the views, while they were still being developed, because he didn't kind of live through a full life, a lot of these ideas were very raw stages, which now theologians are kind of realizing how much depth it had. So when he says that there's that disconnect, he says, I thought I could acquire faith by trying to live a holy life or something like it. It was in that phase that I wrote my book, The Cost of Discipleship. Today I can see the dangers of this book. Though I am prepared to stand by what I wrote, later and I'm still discovering to this very moment that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to believe. So the obedience and responsibility for Bonhoeffer is so interwoven that it's something that cannot be overlooked. So, there was another scholar that suggested that the application of Christology, if someone were to ask Bonhoeffer, why is Christology applied to everything? It seemed they say that the answer Bonhoeffer would say is, my answer is always in Christ. And my dilemma is always in the world. And since Christ has overcome the world, I am therefore confident where I have placed my faith. So that, again, is just a brief, very, very brief look into the ethics of Bonhoeffer. The other aspects that I think contributed to his stand is another concept called the acceptance of guilt. And this, so again, just to read that quote out, he says, God demands responsible action in a bold venture of faith and promises forgiveness and consolation to the one who on account of such an action becomes a sinner. So this essentially is basically saying that his first view about responsible action, and he says that there's no discounting the fact that when you take responsible action, there is guilt and there is, there are repercussions to it. But that's where he says that promises forgiveness and consolation to someone who, on account of this responsible action, became a sinner. So it's really very interesting the way he looks at it. So sorry, I'm just pulling through the document. the acceptance of guilt as a concept was basically to see that Bonhoeffer says that everyone who acts responsibly becomes guilty, and is quick to point out its relation to the acceptance of guilt. It is an inevitable part of the disciples sharing in the cross of Christ. According to Bonhoeffer, Christ is not concerned with his own sinlessness, but solely because of his love for humanity, is able to enter the fellowship of their guilt and take their burden of sin upon himself. So to share, and that he says that the Christian disciple needs to share in other people's need, debasement, and guilt. Just as Christ did not choose to remain the only perfect one at the expense of human beings, but suffered and entered into and accepted the guilt of humankind, the disciple must be willing to suffer and accept the guilt for the sake of others. So Bonhoeffer's acceptance of guilt was, again, another key aspect that influenced his thought. He says, and clarifying what this acceptance of guilt means, he says the taking on of guilt is not only sympathy and understanding for another's deeds, nor is it the intercession for others before God. It is full vicarious action. That is, he who does so for the others and bears the consequences. You know, like Christ on the cross took on our sin and bore the consequences of that sin. Similarly, Bonhoeffer says that the disciples are called to take on the guilt of others. And this is the real acceptance of real guilt. He does not add, I mean, the end, you know, while he says this acceptance of guilt and taking on guilt, he ends that session with saying that God demands responsible action in a bold venture of faith and promises forgiveness and consolation to the one who on account of such an action becomes a sinner. So the clear heartbreak or struggle that Bonhoeffer was going through was that the church was not there for others. You know, he felt that the church was serving its own needs. Germany, the Nazi movement was using the church to propagate it, you know, and that's where his challenges lie. And then the next topic that was, again, very key to his decision is the approval of tyrannicide. So here, I mean, I want to clarify that basically tyrannicide, I mean the killing of a tyrant, and Hitler being the tyrant in this case. So a lot of people have used, you know, the Bonhoeffer example, saying just as Bonhoeffer stood up to authorities and all of that, we need to kind of, you know, use the same thing. And I think that has been misquoted and misused in several instances. Like, for example, there was a shooting of Dr. John Britton in the US by a militant anti-abortion group. And they basically said that because he was performing abortions, that they were doing, you know, they were basically killing of a tyrant. So this, I mean, nothing could be further away from Bonhoeffer's understanding. And I think a lot of people have kind of taken offense to the fact that they're using Bonhoeffer for this. Bonhoeffer clearly, you know, scholars dismiss it, saying that in Hill's case, it was murder, while Bonhoeffer, it was tyrannicide, because he was killing, it was the killing of a dictator engaged in genocide. So there's no tradition in Christian ethics that sanctions the killing of moral adversaries by self-appointed vigilantes. This is a scholar called Green, who basically was justifying and distancing Bonhoeffer from this connection. So Bonhoeffer was not acting by himself. He was not acting on his own action. He was not, this was not just something he wanted. the coup or the planned assassination was literally the last attempt, an absolute last resort to resist the Nazi war and genocide. He was acting against the background of an established moral tradition that allowed tyrannicide against certain defined criteria. He discussed this with theologians and all of that. He did not approve the curtailment and suppression of human rights. It was grounds for direct political action against the state, but not sufficient warrant for the extreme direct action of tyrannicide. For Bonhoeffer, this authoritarian rule was not the problem. It was more that the rule had become fully totalitarian. That's what he was against. So insisting that the government when they restrict the rights and the freedoms of its people, then it forfeits its ability to remain as the power or the governing authority. So this again is a very important thing, because while we often quote Bonhoeffer and highlight the fact that he went against state and all of that, it's very clearly defined criteria that brought him to that point. So as much as I feel he is an example for all of us, I think we all need to follow that very clear understanding of what he's getting into and why he's getting into it. And I think that the focus of that should remain that it came from a very Christian, Christ-centered point. I'm conscious that I don't want to go on too long, and I'm happy for questions and all of that, but I essentially wanted to just put up some other contributions that you might have come across of Bonhoeffer. And again, this is just literally just dipping your toes in the water, and I hope you will continue to look at some of these concepts.
I would just say that I understand. Ideally, I'm also under pressure to close the meeting, but this is so good what your brother did. So you could actually take time, because we need to go back to this video 10 times over to grasp it. So
and I think I think the book, The Cost of Discipleship, is a great insight, and there's loads of study material and things available. So I'll be more than happy to kind of be a part of that with you guys if you want to go through reading that and things like that.
Yes, that'll be great. We could edit that. Thanks. Yeah.
So I'm just going to quickly. I've just got a few more slides. Just want to very quickly just take some of this concepts. So Bonhoeffer, a very big one was cheap grace and costly grace. So it is to cheap grace that Bonhoeffer says. Sorry. So cheap grace, he says, takes sin lightly. Very simply put, cheap grace takes sin lightly. If sin is taken lightly, then the salvation which Jesus purchased is also cheap. Costly grace comes from the realization of how great our sin was and how great the gospel was. So to quote from his book, cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, and absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, and grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. In contrast, costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field for the sake of which a man will go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price, which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. And it is the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. Costly grace is the is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life. And it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. And what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God. And I mean, you can probably go through that again. I'll share this with you. But I think every line is just so packed. It's incredible. And that's kind of what blew me away about Bonhoeffer. The other concept, and I'm just going to go through this very quickly, was religionless Christianity. This, again, while Bonhoeffer was in prison, he began writing, and he began writing with a burden for what the church will be after the Nazi thing. And that's when he talks about religionless Christianity. He says, as part of this, he goes, Old Testament studies played a big influence on this whole idea. And I think that's something that was in discussion at that time, you know, the difference, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So Bonhoeffer very aptly married the two, pointing that it's one continued book, you know, and while people try to argue against and for, he basically said that the Old Testament views are what played a part in his demand for a religionless Christianity. So before we go further, I just want to kind of explain what that means. So for him, the word religion refers in the first place to an overriding concern with the salvation of the individual soul. He says that's what religion is, you know, the kind of ticking the boxes, the things you need to do to save your soul. So, but Bonhoeffer asks, he says that a concern with the saving of one's soul is not known in the Old Testament. Righteousness and the kingdom of God on this earth are central there. They are still central today. Moreover, as the gospel speaks of the redemption of not only the believer, but of all creation. So the word religion for Bonhoeffer was turning to God, you know, when we're in need, when we're in a struggle. And he says it implies seeking God as a God of the gaps. You know, something you can't explain, something you can't think, you turn to God. A crutch in times of suffering. Bonhoeffer, however, makes it clear that God is not a means by which we can be rescued from dangers, have our mysteries solved, and hear our questions answered. He writes that God is not on the borders of life, but at its center, not in weakness, but in strength, not therefore in man's suffering and death, but in his life and prosperity. Similarly, Christ's office is not simply to fulfill our religious needs. He is Lord of our life. So in stating that it's you know, that we don't need a crutch, he's not saying that it's a problem with Christian prayer, and he's not saying that God is not present in our time of needs. He's basically just saying that God has promised to give strength and encouragement, and that is true. But to receive these gifts, the believer has to ask for them, lest we rely on ourselves and not on him alone. And again, this was a very interesting concept that he introduced, where he says God does not give us everything we want, but he does fulfill all his promises. He remains Lord of the earth and still perseveres in the church. So essentially, there was his idea is that he only gives us enough grace for one step. Because if we see 10 steps, then we don't need God. I know the next 10 steps. So he says that dependence is what is that relation. That is how we kind of see God. One thing is certain, we must always live close to the presence of God, for that is newness of life. And then nothing is impossible, for all things are possible with God. So in short, Bonhoeffer's God is not a stopgap God that fills our need for miracles, but rather our helper, our rod, and our staff, even in the valley of the shadow of death. So, yeah, I think the idea of religionless Christianity is a Christianity where the believer lives out his faith in the midst of the world. It speaks of following Christ by being there for others. It demands of the believer that he take up his cross so that Christ's resurrection power may also become manifest. And it demands solidarity with humanity lost in sin. It therefore implies a complete conversion, the dying of the old nature and coming to life of the new. It speaks of a discipleship that finds its strength not just in teaching and preaching, but also and especially in Christian deeds, in praying for and doing right by our fellow men. So that's the bulk of it. Just as a quick kind of recap, the legacy. What does Bonhoeffer teach us today? What can we apply? The Christocentric approach, essentially how everything's centered around Christ, and that stems the action. The social justice or religionless Christianity, which is essentially, like we just said, the acting out of it, the not just ticking the box for my salvation, but accepting of guilt of those around us and humanity around us. The inability that we should not speak of God as two spheres, the world and the holy or the non-holy, or the heavenly or the earthly, but rather the incarnation of Christ itself is a combination of both. And so we have to look at it as both. Christians, we shouldn't retreat from the world, but act within it. And that is the growing and enhancing of faith. Christians must be a voice for those who can't speak for themselves. And these are just a few recaps. So what is truth is God's standard is not just to not lie, but truth is so much deeper, and it's Christ present in our situation today. To be true to God is having a relationship with him. And this is something he kind of fostered even in his seminary days, where he would encourage confession between believers, between Christians, singing of hymns, psalms, and Bible kind of dependence on the word of God. And then the willingness to act in a response to God is beyond just truth telling. It accepts both the guilt and the freedom that comes with responsible action. And to live in the fear of incurring the guilt itself is a sin, according to Bonhoeffer. Because if we are truly in the will of God, then there is no reason for fear. And that takes away from that full experience that we can have in Christ. Again, the motivation of our actions should be to do what is good and right. And that comes from that understanding of Christ and not out of a fear of making mistakes. And if you act responsibly and get involved, it's almost impossible to avoid the incurring of guilt, but the assurance is Bonhoeffer's reminding that Christ truly forgives the one that accepts the guilt on behalf of others. So that's me. I hope I haven't
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that will be all for the YouTube viewers. We'll be now going. I'll be ending the live stream so we can go into the discussion